Thank you, Glenn. Afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Neil Earnshaw from NE Consult. And as Glenn's just said, I'm going to talk about the sort of principles, the concept of ECI and how NEC have interpreted that. And Andy Thompson from Jacobs is going to come up and share his experiences of actually implementing that for real on a highway scheme in Ireland. So let's crack on, shall we? So, just before we get into the detail, let's just take a step back and have a look at where we've come from. I'm sure you'll recognise some of the themes that I've highlighted on the screen there that characterise our industry and have done for many years. We like a good old report, does our industry. There have been many, and they're not all of them. The first one that I came across, I think, was the Simon report from 1944, but I couldn't actually find a copy of that anywhere on the internet to find some pithy quotes to put in here. But there's been regular reports into the industry, all pulling out very similar themes about the fact we should learn to work better with each other. How about this as an example? In no other important industry is the responsibility for the design so far removed from the responsibility for production, said Emerson in 1962. So we think we've come a long way. We now do collaboration now, don't we? Partnering's old hat. We all got bored of that, but we're now all collaborating. But the themes are essentially the same, aren't they? It's all about trying to turn around, face each other, work together. Trying to be more proactive in how we do that, try and avoid ending up in the horrible mess that we used to end up in. So that's sort of where we've come from. The themes continue in the latest government construction strategy that's been published. It's now talking about early contractor involvement as something new that we should be trying. Although I see, maybe I'm just getting old, but I just see emperor's new clothes here. I think an awful lot of us have been doing this by another name for a lot of years in certain ways. So that's my view of the world anyway. So we've kind of moved, haven't we, from no contractor involvement, why would you involve them, what do they know, to early contractor involvement. Now possibly we're into even earlier contractor involvement, I think is my point. That we've progressively tried to take steps to involve the contractor in more and more of the asset creation process, going backwards into the sort of the operational phase when we have to maintain those assets, but working right back into the initial concept and feasibility and underlying business case. And certainly, as I said, I'm starting to feel a little bit old. I've seen this sort of approach used since the 1990s, back in the early days when I first cut my teeth with Yorkshire Water. And we were doing early contractor involvement, just not calling it that. And you'll have seen that yourselves, and I think a very common alternative approach is the use of frameworks. Some of the other procurement methods that you'll see here on the screen are also achieving similar things. Some of them have gone by the wayside, some of them are more popular in other parts of the world, but certainly in the UK, the use of frameworks is now a very common and prevalent approach. That also achieves early contractor involvement. So how might we go about doing that with NEC contracts then? So where the NEC varies from other approaches is that it allows us to enter into a single contract with a contractor to get that early contractor involvement, whereas what we see, particularly in framework arrangements, is the contractor is appointed under a professional services contract to do pre-construction work, and then that merges into a construction contract to finish off any remaining design work and actually build the project. So NEC first published the ECI clauses in January 2016, and then they've incorporated them now as X22 into NEC 4. Hasn't been an awful lot of change between the two versions of the ECI, some very simple changes around terminology. Now we talk about scope instead of works information, contracts are gender neutral, etc., etc. But to all intents and purposes, those ECI clauses in NEC 4 are the same as the ones that were there for NEC 3. So ECI, in the NEC's world, can be either client-led or contractor-led. So the contractor can either be doing the design themselves and leading on that, or merely assisting the client's designer to do the design. So when the client leads for stages 1 and 2, the main option that's chosen must be option C, is what the NEC say. When it's contractor-led, however, you get a bit more flexibility. You can have option C or option E arrangements with your contractor-led ECI. And the intention behind the NEC approach is to incentivize the contractor to make savings against the client's budget. So, as opposed to the traditional option C approach, which is merely incentivizing the contractor to beat their own target, ultimately the client's target is their budget. So we're trying to incentivize, or NEC are trying to incentivize outperformance against the budget, and ultimately to involve the contractor in trying to mitigate costs that otherwise they'd have no influence over. Okay. So that's the sort of real basics of ECI. So what do we need to do at the pre-contract stage then? Well, before going out to tender, the client needs to know what are their requirements. So what are the high-level requirements? What is the project aiming to achieve? So, what is the business case? That needs to have been established, and also to have developed the budget. They need to know what the budget actually is. And then when using this approach, as well as your traditional NEC documents that you'll have and other entries that you need to fill in for your contract data, when choosing X22, you've got additional things to think about, okay, and additional statements to make. So you have to state in there what the budget is, you have to state what reasons there might be, or additional reasons there might be to change the budget. You have to think about what additional insurances you need, for example, professional indemnity insurance. Then you have to work out how you're going to incentivize it. And you really need to be careful about how you put that together, because it comes with both risks and opportunities. If you proceed with an option C ECI contract, you've got to balance out how you're incentivizing the contractor against budget and total project cost, and then how you're also incentivizing them to deliver the works. Okay? There could be a reputational issue if, as a client, you've got to go back to your stakeholders to say, yeah, they did a great job, they've saved this much money against the budget, and they beat the target as well. You're going to get a challenge, especially with its public sector money. You're going to get a challenge from people saying, is that really value for money? Handing over all that extra money to the supply chain. So you've really got to work out how to balance the incentive mechanisms to drive the right behaviours. Then you also have to think about your scope as well. So doing ECI and NEC requires you to think about additional things, to put additional constraints in the scope documents. You've got to define what you mean by stage 1 and stage 2, what needs to be achieved for each of those stages, and to explain what's included in the budget and what the extent of it is, how pricing information is going to be used by the contractor, and what the submission procedure is going to be for stage 2 design proposals as well. Then we have to think about what approvals and consents are needed from others, and to think about issues around intellectual property ownership and any restrictions of materials that the contractor is allowed to use. So there's an awful lot more to think about in ECI, plus you're doing it at a much earlier stage when you're pulling your scope document together than you would be traditionally. So you're much further away from the actual coalface and the actual project materialising. So maybe it's a bit harder to think about all those issues and how you might want to deal with them at such an early stage. So incentivization then. So just like you would do without ECI, the client needs to decide how they want to incentivize it. First decision is, do we want to do option C and have the sort of dual incentivization that we could get with ECI there? Or do we want to go on option E and just merely incentivize the contractor against budget? Okay, so that's the first decision for the client to make. The incentive mechanism, if you're using option C, works just as it would do without ECI. So you're back onto the core clause options, or main option clauses for option C, that you do your first assessment at completion and the final assessment 4 weeks after the defect certificate is issued. And the option C shares pay and gain in just the same way that it would do under a normal option C, final price for work done to date versus final total of prices. So you really do need to think about how you're structuring the pay and gain to drive the right behaviours right from the outset. It is entirely possible to decide that you're going to put all the incentivisation is on the option C arrangement and offer no incentivisation against budget. However, that's going to drive a different kind of behaviour, isn't it? Because effectively, when you're going down the ECI approach, you're working with a single contractor. You've awarded the contract to a single contractor. You've got no sort of market forces at play to establish what the right target cost is going to be. So it could be very easy for the target to be talked up. You know, at a very early stage in a job, there are lots of risks, lots of uncertainties. So in the traditional sort of world, we'd be sort of doing the traditional contractor rubbing chin approach and sort of going, ooh, that's going to be tricky, is that? And oh, we're not sure about that. And you can get lots of risk creeping into target costs at that stage. So you really need to sort of work out how to structure the incentives so that you get the right target cost set with the contractor, so that we're not getting windfall gains once we've gone into stage 2. And everybody's keeping focused on the budget. But it really is up to individual clients to decide how they want to structure it. Arguably, if a client isn't willing to share savings against budget, then why are we going down the ECI approach? There's got to be some willingness to want to do that. Otherwise, you might as well just go down a sort of a traditional approach of using a PSC and an ECC through a separate framework kind of arrangement or something like that. So then looking at how budget changes work, well, there are stated events that may change the budget. So for example, if the PM gives an instruction that changes the client's requirements, that's not a defined term, is it? Works information or scope are defined terms, but client requirements aren't. So you need to be careful about how you write those requirements, otherwise you could end up with a situation where every change becomes a compensation event that changes the budget, whereas we only want sort of real big changes to the project to lead to changes to the budget, things that we haven't anticipated happening, the sort of stuff that is in the territory of unknown unknowns, I guess. So we need to think about that and think about any additional reasons or events that might trigger changes to budgets. There's only a 4-week process to agree changes to the budget, and as you can see, unlike other places in the NEC contracts where it doesn't require agreement, here it does. So collaboration comes much more to the fore to be able to get that budget change sorted. However, in the event that we can't agree it, then the PM can assess it. So again, this could be, if things are starting to go wrong at this stage, if we're getting issues around being able to set the target cost for stage 2, for example, or being able to make sure that we're making sure the budget changes track what's actually happening in the project, then there's a big risk for contractors here that the PM is suddenly in control, and that could start to deteriorate the relationship between the parties if we're not too careful. However, at least it does provide a remedy for us not being able to agree those budget changes. It puts the PM in control, and I guess if the contractor wasn't happy with the PM's decision, then we'd be looking at some form of dispute resolution to sort that out. However, hopefully the whole point of ECI is that we avoid that situation happening. So ECI then has a break point. So traditionally where we'd have used 2 contracts in a framework to achieve the same thing, in ECI we now have a break clause. So the whole progression to stage 2 is dependent on a notice to proceed being issued. And there are reasons for that not to happen. There's a 4-point test in the contract that needs to be applied for us to proceed to stage 2. And then there are provisions in the contract that allow for, if the client decides not to progress to stage 2, which I think we heard from Midlands that approximately 1 in 10 of your schemes doesn't reach that point, and then you choose to do something else. So these clauses are really useful to make sure that in the event that we're not progressing to stage 2, we know where we're going and how we're going to deal with that. So in order to get to stage 2, the contractor needs to submit a design proposal. Remember, the scope described what that design proposal should look like and how it should be submitted. And also that proposal needs to include a project cost and an accepted programme. Reasons in the contract for not accepting the proposal are that it doesn't comply with the scope, that it's going to cause the client to incur unnecessary costs to others, whatever unnecessary means, or that the PM isn't satisfied that prices have been properly assessed. Again, emphasis there on the word properly. What do we mean by properly? So if in the event we're not progressing to stage 2, then the scope is removed, and then we deal with a final account process effectively for stage 1, and we close out at that point. So that's a very sort of quick run through of the ECI clauses as NEC intended them to be used. I'll hand over to Andy now to tell you about the actual reality of trying to apply this on the Dunkettle Interchange Scheme.
Okay, I'm Andy Thompson. I work for Jacobs. I've been doing ECI and NEC for about 15 years now. My first ECI experiences were with the sort of the first tranche of Highways Agency, as it was then, contracts. I was actually a designer at that stage. A bit of an introduction to Dunkettle itself, because I think that the context does matter to a certain extent here. This junction's on the edge of Cork. And as you can see from the picture, we've got the Jack Lynch Tunnel down here, the link from Waterford to the east into Cork City, and Dublin up there. The basic problem with this junction and the driver for the project is that it answers the wrong question. When it was built, the expectation was that most traffic would do that and be running from the east into Cork City. In reality, this area here has seen a huge amount of development, and after the tunnel opened, which came after the junction, a lot of development kind of off the bottom corner, the other side of the tunnel. In essence, it answers the wrong question. The other things that are worth noting about this junction is traffic level is just phenomenal. So it's very sensitive to issues more generally. It seems like everyone in Cork uses it every day. It's mad. The contract uses NEC 3 with the ECI addition. The reason it's 3 rather than 4 was a pure one of timing. We were writing this in the summer, going to the market in the October. It didn't make sense to make that jump. The other piece of context that's relevant here is that use of NEC in the Irish market is relatively limited. There are big headline projects that have done it, but there hasn't been an attempt to use it on a highways project for more than a decade. Okay. Diving into the specifics of the NEC model a little, this sort of builds on what Neil was talking about earlier. So we have this thing called the budget, and that has to go into the contract data as a number. That spans a bunch of other things. Obviously, these boxes aren't the right relative sizes. We have stage 1 cost for whatever our contractor is going to do in agreeing this ECI. We have a stage 2 cost, either option C or option E, as we've talked about. That functions in kind of the normal way, as you would expect, so don't really need to talk about that. And then we have other costs. This is a big question when you're thinking about your budget, of what you put in other costs, because you're going to have to break this down. You're going to have to show it as well. You're going to have to show you're working. So things that might go in there. Well, it's the things that our contractor might be able to influence. Therefore, I have 3 boxes there with question marks in, which is just stuff I've thought of. Doubtless there are other things you could put in here, but land is one. If your contractor has the ability to influence the amount of land you're going to take, that could go in. Statutory undertakers diversions, because typically clients pay direct, so if we can drive down the cost of SU diversions by doing a little more work, that might be a worthwhile thing to do. Possibly employer costs, maybe a little difficult to see how that might work. And definitely employers' risks, because a contractor is going to have a level of responsibility for managing risks that are owned by the employer. His actions are going to influence that level of employer risk, so we're going to have to show that somehow or other. A classic for in there would be 1 in 10 weather. We kind of know there's going to have to be an allowance for over 1 in 10 weather if you've got a longer project, so you probably need something in there. Yeah. Where can the contractor make money on this? My crazy PowerPoint skills now come to the fore. Obviously, at budget level, there is a share can be made at budget, and there is a share that can be made in the sub-block there if it's option C. The interplay between these, becomes very complicated in trying to figure out how you're going to do your incentivization on an ECI contract, because you can lead to all sorts of perverse incentive. So that budget, Neil's already touched on this a little bit, but the budget is only changed in quite limited circumstances. That's the words out of the ECI clauses. And it refers back to these employers' requirements stated in the works information. Well, what are they? If you go to the how-to, there is actually a section in there called employers' requirements, and it gives a list of things that you might put in there. Standards, sizes, limits, capacities, operational performances, things like that. When I was doing this, you read that and you sort of think, right, all of that sort of stuff makes sense if I were building a factory to churn out widgets. A lot of these things are much more difficult to talk about in the context of a highways scheme. Honestly, I've still not quite got to the bottom of what would go in there. What we actually did on Dunkettle was did what Neil suggested you shouldn't, and used the works information. You'll see the reasons for that later. It's because we shifted things around, so it's not important for the budget in section 2. The shares that we were talking about earlier, calculated and paid at the end. So that budget share on the previous slide, at the top level, upside only. There's no pain for contractors there. And where option C is adopted, like I said, how does it interact? Probably not your usual 50-50, which is what we typically expect to see around the 100% figure on contracts. So, things to think about when trying to build this contract. These were the things we found were making us scratch our heads. How influenceable are those other costs? So what's the status of your third-party negotiations for things like statutory undertakers? What's the quality of your site information? How good do we think our data around adjoining land users and things like that are? How accurate is our budget? How confident are we in it? Do we basically believe it? Do we think the job can be delivered for that money? Given it underpins one of the incentives, I mean, it's a blithe thing to say, but it kind of needs to be right. It needs to be deliverable. And do those incentives drive the things that you ultimately want from the project? Like someone said earlier, what you put in the contract will drive what you get back out again. So, looking at the realities of this project, actually pretty limited statutory undertaker's scope. Think back to that plan, there was that gap there, there's not an awful lot in it. Part of the reason that the land hasn't been filled up is that it's very poor, so people have been very reluctant to put stuff in it. And what is known is very well known. We kind of know what we're doing there. The land's taken, that's gone, it's fixed, so there's no flexibility there. And actually, advisors already been procured, fixed price basis, it's gone, there is no option for the contractor to really influence those costs. So there's not an awful lot there. Like I said, the ground conditions particularly difficult on this one. And the principal concern from our client is around disruption. They've had an experience where the tunnel hit issues one day and it essentially gridlocked Cork because of the amount of traffic that then has to divert and the unsuitability or complete absence of alternative routes. So I always, when I'm at this sort of procurement advice stage, think about the old three-pointed triangle of time, quality and cost. This possibly means we have a client here who's a bit less in the cost corner, more towards time and quality. Going back to the law that you can't have all three here, it's just not possible. At the best, you can manage two. And even then, that's going to be a problem. So presumably, we're more interested in time and quality here, which once again feeds your incentive structure and how you're going to think about this, taking the project forwards. Other objectives. We have a client here who's actually, they've made the jump towards NEC, and they've made the jump towards NEC for fairly progressive reasons. They've recognised they need an ability to flex scope here where there's a benefit. When I say benefit, it drives down risk, it improves certainty. benefits the project somehow or other, not necessarily a cash benefit. They wish to incentivise behaviours that lead to a single team approach. Okay, it's a good objective. They don't want, though, to use a sort of a KPI-based system. They want to stick with money, effectively. So no complex or subjective measurement process. They don't want payment on KPI results, for example. And where we are measuring something, they want it to be quite brass tacks. It's time, it's money, it's something you can measure accurately. The other thing they wanted to incentivise, which is really quite interesting for me, was the right price. Not necessarily the cheapest price, the price that the job can actually be delivered at. And to balance that off, they were quite happy to have the valuable incentives, but again, thinking back to what Neil was saying, without the potential for the contractor to walk away with a massive windfall. This is public money at the end of the day. What did we do around some of that stuff for the certainty piece? It just means that in that stage one scope, which again Neil had already talked about, we put in some of the major external approvals. So Eanrod Éireann are the equivalent of Network Rail in Ireland. Their approval was required at detail level during stage one. Things like alignment required in detail at stage one. So looping back to the incentives, how do we do this? As someone else said earlier, you get back what you put in the contract to a certain extent. So how do we model a correct commercial return? How do we drive the contractor towards behaviours we want, therefore giving that contractor the best commercial return they can get out of this contract? So what we realised is because of that lack of other costs, it didn't really make sense on this for a budget incentive to sit at the end. It just doesn't drive what we want, which is back to that right price and risk being driven out. And this has to work for both parties. It has to give the desired behaviours that we want. That's what we're buying. This is what we're trying to drive. So what did we do? Effectively, we picked up that end budget bonus and shifted it to the end of stage one. That involved a Z clause, essentially just took the words that were already there for the bonus at the end and tweaked them a little bit to move it earlier on. We make it more generous than the option C, share. The logic for that is that it will drive out good ideas because you're going to get paid more for them by bringing them forward in the project. So what we should be driving here is a situation where we've got our best project being used to construct the target cost, which ideally should be below the budget. The flip side of that is, because we're paying that out early, if it doesn't materialise, we're going to need a relatively high option C pain. If you think about it, we don't want to give a bonus for some good ideas over here that the contractor then fails to materialise or fails to deliver, and they still get the win for it. We're going to have to set this option C such that we're clawing back if those things don't deliver. Seems reasonable, otherwise we can get played too easily. And we also want a windfall clause to protect the employer. In practice, that's not a terribly difficult thing to do. The other thing we did here to try and balance out risk is not dictate the duration of stage one. All we did was give a completion date for the entire project, which was 4 years. So if our contractor wants to bang through very quickly, there's some pragmatic restrictions on how quickly you can get through stage one because of the scope of it. But you could probably do it in 6 months. Equally, if you'd rather have a year to develop ideas more, get further down the path, and take a shorter construction period as a result, we're game for that. So ultimately, what did we do? Final decisions. We went for a stage one share. As we say, effectively that bonus shifted from the end to the point of notice of pre-construction of 35%. We don't hand over the cash until completion though. Effectively that goes into escrow for the duration of stage two. We then have stage 2 shares of a gain share of 20%. The logic being that this is a double gain share effectively. You've already had the opportunity to get 35%. Why didn't you put it on the table and get 35%? So only 20% gain, but 60% pain to get that clawback that I was talking around earlier. And rather than amend the contract, just put the final share as being 0% in contract data. Keeps things easy. We also wrote a windfall protection clause, which just works on a percentage of the budget. Seems equitable that that's the budget rather than an actual, there was a pressure to make that a written down number. We stuck with budget because it seems equitable. If the project grows logically, so should that windfall cap. Okay. It's not risk-free though. This is still a developing art. Is it the right answer? Don't really know yet. So what are the risks? What if that budget is too low? We're now left in a traditional option C where we have 20% gain and 60% pain, which is actually on my next slide, but never mind. That's going to drive the contractor quite hard, actually, in setting the target if he thinks he's beyond the budget because he's got misproportional pain to gain. He's going to look to push up the target if it breaks the budget. So that just loops back round to the centrality of if you're going down this ECI path, knowing your budget and getting it right. Again, easy to say, harder to do, but that's where you have to be. This can be compounded as well. Irish contracting, if any of you are aware of it, quite cutthroat, quite adversarial. If we end up with a contractor who decides to price on a strategy that they must get so much stage 1 bonus and therefore set other percentages very low, we're running a double risk here because how does this contractor now make money? And the basic thing that I was talking about earlier, the good stage 2 performance, we wouldn't really be rewarding that very strongly because we're only on a 20% share. The 2 bars there are just to give scale between a 20% share in stage 2 and the 35% share if we're in stage 1. And the flip side of that, as I've already mentioned, a very large bar. A colleague from Rousel Wright describes this as giving the contractor massive edge shyness, which is a term I quite like. They're going to be very nervous of tipping over into that orange bar because it hurts hard quick, whereas the blue ones gain slowly, effectively. Just to round off, a few bits of practicalities. The ECI clauses, I mean, they are an admirable document. When I picked them up, I was used to clients' own ECI forms where you would see reams of paper to make ECI work. The NEC clauses are 3 pages. I kind of couldn't believe that they did everything they needed to when I first picked them up. But they do, and they're actually really good. But they do generate a bunch of extra work which you need to know about and be on top of from day one. First up of things that I've sort of drawn out from that is that definition of stage 1. Obviously, you have to define what you want doing during stage 1, and we ended up with a list of like 49 items, which is do this, do this, do this, do this. One of those being deliver me a target cost. But how do you keep that flexible enough, going back to our original thing of we want that flexibility for the contractor to be able to advise us and say, I want to go and get some survey data about this. I want to do some more design around that. And a question I'm still not entirely sure I've got the right answer to. Are movements from stage 2 to stage 1 compensation events? I haven't actually changed my scope. All I've done is moved it from one place to another. And I have, next box down, a forecast which I approve on a monthly basis, which effectively acts as a hard cap on stage 1 cost. My only grounds for rejecting it are that it contains work that's not required for stage 1. So if we've agreed that something that sits in the overall scope should jump from what we thought was stage 2 into stage 1, how do I do it? And the best answer I've come up with is that you include it in the forecast for stage 1. It just means you've got something ticked off the list for stage 2 early. And I guess the same could work the other way around. If you've got something that you thought was stage 1, but you've actually realised that it's not going to deliver any value to do it at this precise moment in time, as we have with some property surveys, for example, we've decided to just leave them. There's a whole question there around the mechanisms. I'm not convinced I have the right answer on that one. I know what I've done. And also the target cost process. Is there even a need to define your target cost process? Obviously, this is something that is going to get people animated and interested. What do you want to do about this? The approach we took was effectively to get the contractor to tell us what they were going to do, rather than telling them what they must do. I'm not wholly sure we got the balance right on this one. Certainly on the corporate governance front, we should have been stronger in the contract around, you must give us this many weeks for getting corporate governances through. So hopefully that's been an interesting little tour around some of the issues with ECI. It is tricky. And developing those incentives, the interplay is really, really complicated. I started trying to produce some slides showing what would happen with different share ranges, and it just got so complicated I gave up. Obviously, I can explain that to anybody who's interested in doing it, but it's not something I could get across in a forum like this. Overall conclusions, back to that budget again. It's got to be right, basically. And those interplays between the budget and the option C shares, if you're going down option C, are complex. There's loads of room there for getting perverse incentives, especially if you've got a relatively early ECI where your scope is a bit loose. I was thinking around a problem where if your scope was deal with statutory undertakers, and then later on, a great idea is thought up that costs more but saves on SUs, you start running the numbers, you can get some really weird outcomes which are not what you would want. And know that ECI generates some new administrative tasks which you won't be familiar with and which will need looking after from day one. You probably have to drive the contractor to do them. Thank you very much, that's me.
Okay, we will just squeeze one or two questions in. Any question for either Andy or Neil? Any questions on ECI? I know it's lunchtime, but we have got time for just one or two. Just while I need to fire up another slide.
I've always got questions.
Dean.
I'm going to ask the same question I asked earlier about how you dealt with risk at the end of stage 1.
Yeah, I mean, there is a slug of risk going to go into the target. It's a priced risk register, gone through Monte Carlo, all of that sort of stuff. There is, yeah, a comprehensive priced risk register and an approach that risk must be in the risk register rather than put into prices for activities. You have to set that stall out fairly early and stick to it. Yeah, you can't have a scenario where you've got risk buried in the rate for doing a task and a risk sat on top of it as a general blob of risk.
That is the project risk register and not the risk register, don't forget.
Which is the early warning register, Richard. So it's that's fine now.
I've made that philosophical leap to early warning register being a separate thing. Yeah.
Any other one last question on ECI? Okay, I do get it's lunchtime, I'm well aware. Right, let's just close out this morning's session. So I'd like to thank all the speakers from this morning. Really informative topics. I think every single one of them, there's something for us to learn from and challenge from and have debates. So we take a little different tour now for the rest of the session. So when we come back after lunch, you're going to be going straight into your breakout groups.
There's a whole question there around the mechanisms. I'm not convinced I have the right answer on that one. I know what I've done. And also the target cost process. Is there even a need to define your target cost process? Obviously, this is something that is going to get people animated and interested. What do you want to do about this? The approach we took was effectively to get the contractor to tell us what they were going to do, rather than telling them what they must do. I'm not wholly sure we got the balance right on this one. Certainly on the corporate governance front, we should have been stronger in the contract around you must give us this many weeks for getting corporate governances through. So hopefully that's been an interesting little tour around some of the issues with ECI. It is tricky. And developing those incentives, the interplay is really, really complicated. I started trying to produce some slides showing what would happen with different share ranges, and it just got so complicated I gave up. Obviously, I can explain that to anybody who's interested in doing it, but it's not something I could get across in a forum like this. Overall conclusions, back to that budget again. It's got to be right, basically. And those interplays between the budget and the option C shares, if you're going down option C, are complex. There's loads of room there for getting perverse incentives, especially if you've got a relatively early ECI where your scope is a bit loose. I was thinking around a problem where if your scope was deal with statutory undertakers, and then later on, a great idea is thought up that costs more but saves on SUs. You start running the numbers, you can get some really weird outcomes which are not what you would want. And know that ECI generates some new administrative tasks which you won't be familiar with and which will need looking after from day one. You probably have to drive the contractor to do them. Thank you very much, that's me.
Okay, we will just squeeze one or two questions in. Any question for either Andy or Neil? Any questions on ECI? I know it's lunchtime, but we have got time for just one or two. Just while I need to fire up another slide.
I've always got questions.
Dean.
I'm going to ask the same question I asked earlier about how you dealt with risk at the end of stage one.
Yeah, I mean, there is a slug of risk going to go into the target. It's a priced risk register, gone through Monte Carlo, all of that sort of stuff. There is, yeah, comprehensive priced risk register and an approach that risk must be in the risk register rather than put into prices for activities. You have to set that stall out fairly early and stick to it. Yeah, you can't have a scenario where you've got risk buried in the rate for doing a task and a risk sat on top of it as a general blob of risk.
That is the project risk register and not the risk register, don't forget.
Which is the early warning register, Richard. So it's that's fine now.
I've made that philosophical leap to early warning register being a separate thing. Yeah.
Any other one last question on ECI? Okay, I do get it's lunchtime, I'm well aware. Right, let's just close out this morning's session. So I'd like to thank all the speakers from this morning. Really informative topics. I think every single one of them, there's something for us to learn from and challenge from and have debates. So we take a little different tour now for the rest of the session. So when we come back after lunch, you're going to be going straight into your breakout groups.